New gave me a weird text this morning. And I say weird because if you are into preaching and into expository preaching, then you know you like to take sections that fit together, right, of the Bible. And New gave me one that it just doesn't quite. If you'd been at Ozark, my preaching professor would have said, nope, because verse 37 doesn't really fit with verses 26 through 36, but we're doing it anyway, and I found a way to make it work and tie it into TCI. So, the title of this message is Rejected Love. And I want to start with a quick story of being in the 5th grade. When I was in the 5th grade, we had just moved from Lexington, Kentucky. Can I get an amen? Go Wildcats. To Boulder, Colorado. You talk about a cultural shift. Going from the Bible Belt and a great church, Southland Christian Church, that I grew up in under a guy named Wayne Smith. My dad was an elder there, and I'd moved to Boulder, Colorado, which is like, this far from hell. And culturally, it was a cesspool back in the 70s back then. And we got involved in a church in Longmont, Colorado. It was a great church, but it was a little drive away, so my friends weren't from church anymore. My friends were not Christians, and it was a tough place to grow up. But I did meet a guy right away named Joe Seraphin. He just lived a few houses down on the street, and we became friends quickly in the 5th grade, and he introduced me to some other people in the neighborhood, and one was this girl named Kim Vandenoord. And, 5th grade, guys are starting to take an interest in girls, and I'm like, ooh, she's a good-looking girl. And we'd play in the neighborhood, as kids, and that was back in the days when, kids just ran all over the place, and they came home when they knew they were going to be in trouble if they didn't. And nobody worried about things, and so we played all kinds of games out in places around the neighborhood, and I just continued to think that Kim was a really pretty girl. And so somewhere in the 5th grade, I got the guts up to ask her to go with me. Okay. I don't know what terms people use today in junior high or grade school or whatever, but back then we used to say, when you asked if a girl would be your girlfriend, you say, will you go with me? What a dumb thing to say. Go where? And the answer was nowhere, because basically going with someone meant that you pass notes through their friends back and forth. You didn't really talk to each other. You didn't even hardly have the guts to ever hold her hand or anything like that, but that was your girlfriend. So I asked her, will you go with me? And I got this response. Scott, I don't want to ruin our friendship. You all know what that means. I have absolutely no romantic interest in you, Scott Weber, but to let you down with the least embarrassment possible, I'm going to say, I don't want to ruin our friendship. But I wouldn't take no for an answer. Idiot. So I continued to call her, going back to my parents' bedroom, because we didn't have cell phones, we didn't even know what that would be one day, but I would call her from the landline, and I would talk her head off about all kinds of things, and then I would end the call again with the call, hey, will you go with me? Nope, don't want to ruin our friendship. And I hate to even think what she was thinking on those phone calls, oh no, not him again, or whatever, but my puppy love was rejected. And even a little 5th grader can feel the pain of rejected love. But the older you get and the more serious love gets, then you can understand the pain of rejected love. And I want to talk this morning about the most important rejected love in the text from Matthew chapter 23, verses 29 to 37. So let's begin. Open your Bibles there if you want. Look on the screen. We're going to read verses 29 through 36 to begin with.
Hey, Scott, we stand up when we read the scripture.
Okay, let's do that. Stand up. New tradition, love it. Stand up. For the sound guy, I cough more than New Nugent, so when you see my hand go up to my face, you know I'm going to cough. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Here we go. This is from the New American Standard Bible. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we'd been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your guilt, the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. You may be seated. The Pharisees, who I know you're familiar with now because you've been going through these red letters of Jesus, red words of Jesus. The Pharisees were corrupt religious leaders. Most of them were corrupt, and they were, in fact, hypocrites. This isn't the first time that Jesus called them hypocrites. They said one thing, they did another. They bound heavy burdens on the people, but not on themselves. They managed to find their way out of religious obligations that they wouldn't let others out of. It was really, really terrible. But they claimed that if they had been living back when their ancestors lived, they would not have treated the prophets as harshly as their ancestors did. They would never have killed any of those prophets. And Jesus says, you're wrong. You would have done it too. In fact, Jesus says, you're actually going to do it with new people I send to you. And it's interesting because they had already done it with John the Baptist, who was there at the beginning before. Thank you, Gary. Before Jesus started his ministry and during the early part of his ministry. The prophets before the time of Jesus were in one sense very revered by the people of Israel while they were prophets, but in another sense, they were annoying. And they were rejected because they seldom brought a message you wanted to hear. God usually sent the prophets not to say, hey, you're doing a great job. Keep it going. He sent the prophets to warn them that they were rejecting God's plan. They were rejecting his message of love, which was he was using Israel to prepare them for the Messiah to come. And instead of being the light to the nations they were supposed to be, they were always doing the wrong thing. And so the prophets would warn them of impending judgment if they kept doing what they were doing, and no one wanted to hear that, so they were rejected and very often persecuted and killed. Never think when you're reading the prophets of the Old Testament, wow, it would have been great to be Isaiah. It would have been tremendous to be Jeremiah. No, you would not have wanted to be in their shoes. Jesus said, I will send you more prophets and teachers who will reveal to you that I am, in fact, who I claim to be. I am the prophet, the priest, and the king. I am the one that all the other prophets point to, Jesus had said in his ministry. One of these Pharisees, and I know you're familiar with him already, at the time he went by the name Saul or Saul, later to be known as Paul, the Apostle Paul, who writes so many of the New Testament books that we read, you know. Some of your favorite verses in the Bible come from Paul, but you have to remember who he was. At the time that Jesus is saying this, Paul is studying to be a Pharisee. In fact, he's studying under the best scholar of the day, Gamaliel. And we see Jesus' prophecy coming true in Saul, to be later known as Paul. Luke gives his testimony in the book of Acts several times. In Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, after the stoning of Stephen, it says that Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him, but Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women. He would put them in prison. Think that through, house to house. As he got wind that this house has believers in Jesus in it. They follow Yeshua. They claim he is their Messiah. We're getting them. In Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, way up north in Syria, so that if he could find any belonging to the way. That was an early way of knowing who the Christians were. They were part of the way. Both men and women, he might bring them bound back to Jerusalem. So Luke is very honest about how Saul would treat the followers of Jesus because they were following Jesus. 1 Corinthians 5:9, we begin to get a taste of how Saul speaks in the first person about himself and his former life. So Paul then, into the Corinthians, says, I am the least of the apostles and not fit to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. What a thought it must have been to know that now that I am a follower of Jesus myself, in fact, now that I'm an apostle, and I am a missionary to places like Corinth in Greece, I have this haunting memory of what I used to be and what I used to do. We see it again in Acts 22, 3-4, but we'll skip to Acts 26, 9-11, where Paul says, so then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues. I tried to force them to blaspheme, meaning he tried to force them to say, I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, Paul makes this statement so many of you are familiar with, where he talks about the thorn in the flesh. But he doesn't tell us what it was. And so people have hypothesized throughout the centuries what was Paul's thorn in the flesh, which he prayed to God fervently 3 times, please take this away from me. But God's answer was basically no. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness, or your weakness. And some scholars have wondered if this thorn in the flesh wasn't the constant, haunting memory that he was the persecutor of the church. That he had rejected God's love himself. He had rejected the message of the ultimate prophet, Jesus. I know that as Christians, we want to imagine that there is no way that we would have ever been there at the trials of Jesus in the crowd chanting those words. Oh, notice how softly you said that? Crucify him! Crucify him! There's no way that I would have done that. Oh, look what I just did to my voice. When you get older, you can't do that anymore. Careful, New. I never thought when I was young I could have possibly been in that crowd yelling, crucify him. Because I had already at a young age accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, so I was never in a place mentally where I could imagine myself being opposed to him. And though my faith in Jesus has never wavered, I certainly understand now. I could have easily been there in that crowd had I not been born into a Christian family, had I not been taught about Jesus at an early age, had I been raised Jewish in that culture back then, I could have easily been in that crowd, just as Saul, could have been part of that crowd yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." It could have been me and you. Then there's the rejected lover. As we transition to verse 37, Jesus then, after announcing all these woes to the Pharisees, says in probably a passionate way, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets, stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling." God had done so much from the time of the Garden of Eden. He had done so much to redeem his people from that curse of sin that began in the garden. And certainly beginning with the Exodus and the chosen people of Israel, all he had done for them, the Exodus itself, the taking of the promised land, just on, and yet time after time, his own people kept rejecting God's love message. God's love message is really not hard to find in all of the prophets, especially in Isaiah. I mean, you go to Isaiah 53, it's just explicit that one day someone was going to come and take on the sin of all of us and atone for our sins. God's message was never about be good enough to be in my presence. It was always about you're not good enough, but I'm sending you somebody who's going to make you right with me. He's going to pay the penalty. Your sin is paid for so you can be in my presence. That was the message through the prophets. But it was rejected. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that name represents in that context the people of Israel. He's not talking about the physical place, he's talking about the people. They were gathered in Jerusalem for the Passover to remember God's love, and yet they rejected God's love. So what? So what? What about you and me? Do we ever reject the love of Jesus? Well, we often praise him with our lips just the way we did this morning. And it felt very easy for me and natural. But then we disobey him. Little things, big things after we leave this building. And yet Jesus said in John 14:15, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Do we reject God's love just by virtue of the way that we refuse to live the way he called us to live? Jesus said in another context in Luke 6, "If you call me Lord, Lord, and yet you do not do what I say," that's rejecting the love of God. We say we long for the return of Jesus, but our behavior does not always suggest that we are, because we're often living for the moment. Our plans, our short-term plans, our long-term plans often show that we're really looking for something here on this earth. And we almost kind of hope he delays coming until we experience this or this or this. And I would suggest that's rejecting the love of God. Do you ever distance yourself from other Christians who kind of have a prophetic voice? Those who are loudly calling out the cultural sin of our day, and you just don't want to be associated with that. Do they embarrass you for being too zealous when you're outside of a comfortable Christian group? Do you stay quiet when LGBTQ pride issues are being spoken of in a positive light? That's a big one in our day. Do you ignore the plight of confused young people who are identifying as transgender or any other number of confused genders? Do you just stay quiet instead of speaking the truth from God's order of creation? He created them male and female. When someone brings up their anger, which has happened a lot recently in our political environment, that women's basic human rights are being taken away, meaning only the right to an abortion, do you avoid correcting them and standing up for the truth that an abortion is not about a woman's right to her own body? It's about another human being inside of God's created order in a woman's body. And abortion is taking away, attacking the image of God. These are things that people don't want to talk about at parties, right? You don't want to be the party killer. And yet when we stay quiet on such cultural issues, we're rejecting the love of God. Because we, as I see it, we're called to be light in darkness and salt into a decaying society. Not to simply passively just ignore culture, hoping that somehow it'll come around on its own, because it won't. There are, in fact, false prophets and teachers in our day that ought to be rejected. There are those who focus on the gospel being a completely false version, a health and wealth gospel. When I was here, I used to often speak against Joel Osteen from this pulpit, and other preachers won't do that. I do it quickly, because I don't want you ever watching Joel Osteen. And if you're going to a church right now or have gone to a church where they preach a health and wealth gospel, you get out of there, because it's a false teaching. And it does not proclaim the gospel of grace, which tells us that we're going to suffer in this world and we're going to be hated just as Jesus was hated. That doesn't mean we go out and try to be hated, but it means that don't look for this to be your best life now, and that's one of his books, Your Best Life Now. There are prophets who ought to be rejected, loudly against. But my fear is not so much that we're messing up there. My fear is that we try to blend into culture in order to not attract the rejection of other people towards us. Because it might hurt me economically. I might not advance in my company. My neighbor down the street might speaking badly of me. Whatever it is. Our call from Jesus is to holy living and to loving the unlovable. This means a balance of loving the sinner but not accepting their sin as okay, just like Jesus didn't. He accepted the adulterous woman and said, "Go and sin no more." We do what Jesus did. He loved the sinner, but he called them out of their sin. And it's no different today for all of humanity. If the Pharisees had only repented and put their faith in the prophet of prophets, Jesus, their sin would have been given. They would have been reconciled to God, and they would have known and been embraced by the greatest love known to man. But most of them didn't. And it's the same for you and I. If we put our faith in what Jesus did for us on the cross, dying for our sin, taking the penalty upon himself, then you can be reconciled to God. You can have peace with God. The gospel of Jesus is not difficult to understand. It's just sometimes difficult to swallow. Because it first requires us to admit our own sin and guilt. Not to start out with what you're doing is okay. Why don't you? Jesus is okay with you. He's not okay with you now if you haven't accepted him. You are an enemy of God if you have not accepted him. But the great news is you don't need to be, because God did all he could to make you not an enemy, but to make you his child. But it requires that you admit that need first, and then come to Him, and then pursue holy living. Now, let me show you love not rejected. Let me show you love embraced through a ministry called TCI, which this church has been supporting since 2014. Let's go to the next slide. TCI is Tversky Christian Institute. It was founded in 1997. That's when the classes first began, as a place to train Christian leaders in the south portion of Ukraine. The actual city was Kherson, Kherson. They kind of keep the K silent. Kherson. And we knew from the beginning this wasn't going to be it. Our church in Estes Park, Colorado, that I was serving at the time, was one of the 8 churches that helped found this ministry. And the church in Estes Park is still supporting them heartily, and the church here is still supporting them very well. And thank you so much for that. In my retirement, I'm not working full-time for them, so it's not full-time, man. It's very part-time that I work as a director of development for them, basically raising awareness and raising funding for them, especially since the war started. In the year 2000, we began there at TCI to branch out because we always wanted to reach into Muslim-dominant countries, especially in Central Asia. All the countries that end in stan, you know. And so our first venture was in Uzbekistan, starting in the year 2000. In 2019, TCI became the first Bible college, the first Christian college in all of Ukraine to be licensed by the state, by the government of Ukraine as a college, which was huge because it means if you get a degree at TCI in ministry, you can then go get a master's degree in business administration somewhere else at another college. They recognize those degrees. The first Christian college to be able to do that, 2019. In 2022, the tragedy began in February of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And everybody knew about that. Everybody was talking about it then. And the war's still going on, and we don't talk about it a lot anymore because we have a short attention span as Americans. I understand that firsthand. But in 2022, they relocated to the western part of Ukraine and began to do their ministry there and continue their ministry in Central Asia and another area called the Caucasus region. We'll look at that in a moment. But they just relocated in June to the capital of Kiev, knowing that that's where their student base is always going to be from. The young people live around Kiev, and so they've relocated there. Next slide. This is, it might be hard for you to see there, I'm sure it is, but it's just a graphic that shows you the reach of TCI, training Christian leaders. So the thing that people tend to get jazzed about is not so much training Christian leaders in Ukraine, but the fact that TCI has branches in all of these other countries. So beginning in 2000, Uzbekistan, in 2009, we went in the Caucasus to the country of Georgia. And then in 2010, we went to Tajikistan. In 2015, we began to work with what some people have traditionally called the Gypsy peoples, but they're traditionally also known as the Roma people throughout Eastern Europe. And then we branched out beginning in 2018 to Kyrgyzstan, 2021 Kazakhstan, this is during the war. 2023 to Kazakhstan, and then in this year, Azerbaijan. 2 new campuses during the war, while the people of TCI, the staff and the students, they themselves are a displaced people. Imagine you're going to FAU, and all of a sudden one day you get a call and you have to get up and physically leave, leaving all of your belongings behind, and you have to travel to Missouri. And suddenly you're sleeping on people's floors in their homes and in churches, in their auditoriums, and then a month later you get a rented building and you resume classes in Missouri. And for 2 years you do that. You're a displaced people. That's what they did. And during that time they continue to establish new campuses in Central Asia. And of course, all the ministry in Central Asia, all of these countries except for Georgia, are Muslim countries where it's illegal to share your faith. In some countries, like Uzbekistan, it's technically legal to have a church, but it has to be registered with the state, and it's almost undoable. But you can't share your faith. You can be put in prison. I've known people who have been. I've known people who have died in those countries for their faith. And yet we have 166 students in Central Asia training to be Christian leaders, youth pastors, pastors of churches. Some are just training to be better Sunday school teachers. And they're doing it in a place where it's very dangerous because they don't reject God's love. They embrace it. Next slide. TCI has two different types of students, bivocational pastors, the concept of what I was for so many years and what New is today, and other staff members being full-time at a church. It's just a foreign concept in Ukraine. I've known 2 full-time pastors in my whole life in Ukraine. All the others are bivocational. They have other careers and they are church leaders, which is interesting because that's the way it was in the Bible. And for a Bible-believing church, it's a new thing to kind of recapture, that we don't always have to. Everybody who serves the church doesn't have to be a full-time pastor. So we train bivocational pastors because it's tough for them to juggle both. And so we really tailor our education to them and tailor our schedule to their schedule rather than requiring them to, uproot their careers in order to study at TCI. We also teach young adults from local churches, meaning just like in America, someone graduates from high school and goes off to Bible college. Next slide. That just shows some students. They're just like here in America. Next slide. March 10th, 2022. TCI was located on the banks of basically the Mississippi River of Ukraine, the Dnieper River. And they were basically like New Orleans, where it empties into the Gulf. Except for them, it empties into the Black Sea, so extremely strategical location. So that's where the Russians went first. And Kherson was the only city they successfully took outside of the separatist, Donetsk, eastern regions of Ukraine. And so they took, very early in the war, they took over TCI's campus. TCI fled on the first day of the war. They had an evacuation plan. They went west to Ivano-Frankivsk. But more on that in a moment. The Russian army took over this campus that I had been to so many times. Next slide. They set up barracks there. They set up perhaps a medical place for soldiers who were injured. They set up mobile crematoriums right there on the campus of TCI. Next slide. Just people, the way we got these pictures is Christians in the area taking their smartphones and just kind of walking through the campus, being unnoticed, and then just clicking the camera, risking their lives to get these pictures. Ammunition, next slide. There's guys in boot camp in the Russian army. Next slide on the soccer fields. Then, August 28th and 29th of 2022, Ukraine successfully retook that southern area, the Kherson region, including the city of Kherson, pushed the Russians back over the Dnieper River, where they are to this day. That's the front line, the Dnieper River, and retook Kherson. So the Russians said, well, if we have to leave, we're going to destroy every building on this campus on our way out. And so all 5 buildings were completely leveled, and you see the destruction here. They also destroyed all 30,000 volumes of the best Christian library in Ukraine. All 30,000 volumes gone. Next slide. More damage. Next slide. More damage. I worked on those buildings. I helped remodel those buildings. Next slide. There's the library, and those the 2 pictures on the right are at the city dump. And none of the books were recoverable. Next slide. Going back to the beginning of the war, TCI led the effort of humanitarian work. Amazing. They didn't have FEMA, not that FEMA is doing a great job right now in North Carolina and other southeastern states, but at least there's something from the government. There was nothing from the Ukrainian government for humanitarian relief, but there was from the Christians. They led the way. a magazine in America called Christianity Today, a magazine that was started by Billy Graham a long time ago, twice featured articles about TCI and Valak Sinny, its president, because they were leading the way in humanitarian aid. Starting on the first day of the war, they bought 2 vans. This church sent $20,000 towards one of those vans, purchased one of those vans. And those vans were used and used and used, and God's sovereignty was present there as it broke down, and then they would get them repaired quickly, and how they got them repaired, great stories. But over 1,000 people were evacuated by those 2 vans from the war zone back towards the west in Ivano-Frankivsk and other areas. And then, so they could be efficient, they were always bringing humanitarian aid, food, and medical supplies back to the war region, using back country roads to avoid the Russian checkposts in order to smuggle in these supplies. They fed over 64,000 people that way. There's other stories, harrowing stories of how they used boats at night with no light across the Dnieper River to get food to Kherson. Amazing work they did, all while they're trying to run a college, you know. Next slide. Over 50 churches were physically destroyed, meaning church buildings. Over 400 churches ceased to exist in the beginning weeks and months of the war, just closed up, haven't opened back up. And over 500 pastors of Bible-believing churches are gone, most of them having fled the country, displaced people to other countries, because they knew they would be targets. And so now there's a dearth of pastors and a need to train more pastors. Next slide. So TCI survived. That upper right-hand corner, I'm there, but they never put me in the picture. I never can figure that out. I'm always one person away from being in the picture. But that's Valak Sinny in the middle being prayed for in the upper right. And that was the 25th anniversary of TCI. I was there. It was the first year of the war. We were in Ivano-Frankivsk, celebrating and encouraging them as much as we could, because they continued to do the work. Next slide. They not only survived, but they thrived. They're still giving out degrees. The bottom right, that's the students in Uzbekistan. You know, they're excited about what they're doing and about the degrees they're receiving. And up at the top are some bivocational pastors who graduated in Ivano-Frankivsk this last year and got theirs. The bottom left, I think, is Tajikistan. But they're thriving. Next slide. They rented a campus in Ivano-Frankivsk for 2 years. Very small compared to what they had, but enough to get by, but it cost them $8,000 a month. They lost 40% of their income on the first day of the war because they were self-sufficient to the degree of 40%, meaning they were raising their own funds through a creative use of their campus, renting for business conferences and camps, and they also had a growing business agriculturally to grow tomatoes and cucumbers, staples for Ukrainians, out of season in greenhouses. And that all got seized by the Russians in the first part of the war, so they lost 40% of their income, but their expenses went up. Next slide. The first thing I began to work on as director of development was knowing that their accreditation and licensing was in danger. If you don't have a library, how do you maintain your standing as a college? And they scrapped together about 1,500 books in Ivano-Frankivsk, but I was traveling in California on their behalf with a guy named Sergei Dishkariani who works with TCI, and we had just been to Hope International University, and we kind of struck out there with getting anything major done. But you know, they said, well, we get pastors' libraries donated to us when they retire, and we could give you a dozen books here, 100 books here over time. And the thought it was so overwhelming, trying to rebuild a 30,000 volume library, and then a light bulb hit. Lincoln Christian University in Lincoln, Illinois, unfortunately, was closing its doors after the next semester. And I said, I'm about ready to go to ICOM, the International Conference on Missions. I'll be going there again this November, but this is last November. And I approached the president of Lincoln Christian University, and I approached the president of Ozark Christian College, and that's my alma mater. And so I went to Matt Proctor, and I said, you're supposed to be receiving this library from Lincoln Christian University, because when they close, you're taking in their seminary program, their advanced degree program, master's program. And what would you think instead of donating that library to TCI? Letting it be like an organ transplant from a dying college to a college that's hurting but can live on. And he loved the idea. And then we went to Silas McCormick at LCU, and he said, wow, what a great idea. And then he got me with the librarian, Leslie Starasta at LCU, and providentially, all her ancestors are from Ukraine. And she says, this is a great idea. And so thus began the replacement of their library. At the same time, President Zelensky was making English an official language of Ukraine, so that anybody who got an advanced degree, all lawyers, all doctors, all city government workers, all government workers, had to learn English. It wouldn't be their official language, which would be Ukrainian, because they were now rejecting the Russian language, but English would become an official language. Therefore, all of these books would be recognized. And so we worked for a year. And thanks to Lincoln Christian University and an organization called Scholar Leaders, we were able to put together these books and last March get them into a container. And about 2 weeks ago, they made it to a port on the East Coast. And now that the port workers' strike is over, it should be on a boat soon heading for Kiev, Ukraine. And so we're thankful for that. Next slide. By the way, we're up to over 31,000 books now for their library. This is the new campus in Kiev. They're renting that for $6,500 a month. So a much bigger building for less money in Kiev. And if you watch them on Facebook, for some of you who've been around with them for a long time, you know that they're really excited about being in Kiev. And it's very strategic for them to be there. Easier travel in and out through the Kiev airport when it opens back up. And much better access to other Christian ministries to partner with, a student base that's never ending, because the young people all fled Kherson and other cities, and they all went towards Kiev. So it's a strategic move for us, but we're renting the building, and we hope to buy it. Next slide. On August 28th through 30th of next year, we're going to dedicate the new library, because the library has to be built out on the first floor. We hired engineers. We met them at the International Conference of Missions last year, and they basically donated all their services, and they went to Ukraine, and they engineered for all of the renovations to happen in that building, and including $82,000 worth of work on the first floor. There's 4 floors, and to get that was an amazing donation from them. And to find a way to renovate that the cost could be closer to $90,000, they're saying now, but that's an amazingly small price for probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 square feet to be renovated. And so that's our first financial need, is to renovate that so that we can be ready by next year in August for that library to be dedicated to the Lord. And guess what the date is? It's 3 years to the date of when their library was destroyed by the Russian army. And that's why that date was chosen. Next slide. So completing the library is a financial need, and purchasing the facility, which we think will cost us about $2.50. It's going to be available for us to purchase, but we've got to have the money to do so first. And so Connected Life has been such a faithful partner of TCI for 10 years now, since 2014. And we're just asking you to continue doing that, and to consider not only what the church is doing for all of you collectively, but what some of you might want to do individually who have a heart for reaching out to Muslim nations through Central Asia and training Christian leaders there, and for what's happening in Ukraine and helping students be trained for ministry in Ukraine. And so I thank you for your time this morning. I'm going to turn it back over to New, and God bless you all.